My name is Irma Sullivan. I'm 58 years old, and I used to believe that forgiveness was the highest virtue a Christian woman could possess. For 32 years, I sat in the third pew from the front at Blessed Redeemer Methodist Church, my hands folded in my lap, my voice joining the hymns in perfect harmony with the congregation. I baked casseroles for potluck dinners, organized the Christmas pageant for 7 consecutive years, and never missed a Wednesday evening prayer meeting. I was the woman who brought fresh flowers from my garden every Sunday, who stayed late to help stack chairs after fellowship hour, who smiled sweetly when Pastor Henley asked for volunteers for the church cleaning committee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To everyone in Cedar Falls, I was the picture of devotion and grace. Irma Sullivan, the widow who found her purpose in service to the Lord. Irma Sullivan, the woman who channeled her grief into good works after losing her husband Thomas to cancer 5 years ago. Irma Sullivan, the quiet soul who never spoke ill of anyone and always offered the other cheek when slighted. I wore my faith like a well-pressed dress, crisp and proper, and never showing the wrinkles underneath. But that version of me died the day I discovered what the church ladies had been saying about me behind their prayer circles and covered dish suppers. It died the moment I realized that while I was pouring my heart into serving a community I thought loved me, they were dissecting my life like vultures picking at roadkill. And when it died, something else was born in its place. Something that understood that sometimes the most righteous thing you can do is sin so spectacularly that it shakes the foundations of hypocrisy itself. What I did next changed everything. Not just for me, but for the 3 families who thought they could tear down a grieving widow with whispered accusations and manufactured scandals. By the time I was finished, their perfectly ordered lives had crumbled, their businesses had vanished into thin air, and they learned that the quiet church mouse they'd been tormenting had claws sharper than any of them could have imagined. The first crack in my perfect Christian facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the maple leaves were just beginning to blush orange around the edges and the air carried that crisp promise of autumn. I was standing in the checkout line at Morrison's grocery, clutching a basket filled with ingredients for my famous apple cinnamon coffee cake, the one I brought to every church function because people always asked for the recipe. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the church's women's auxiliary, was 2 people ahead of me, her silver hair perfectly coiffed beneath a burgundy hat that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a week. I was debating whether to add a bag of pecans to my basket when I heard my name float over the soft murmur of grocery store conversation. Not unusual in itself, Cedar Falls was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and being recognized was as common as breathing. But something in the tone made me pause, made me tilt my head just slightly toward the voices coming from the next aisle over. "Well, I'm just saying, Irma Sullivan has been acting mighty strange lately," came the unmistakable nasal drawl of Beatrice Whitmore, the church secretary whose idea of Christian charity involved keeping detailed mental files on everyone's personal business. "Did you see her at the Hendersons' barbecue last month? She was talking to that young man for an awfully long time." My breath caught in my throat. The young man she was referring to was Jake Morrison, Mrs. Henderson's nephew, a sweet kid who'd just graduated from state with a degree in agriculture. He'd been telling me about his plans to start an organic farming co-op, and I'd been genuinely interested because Thomas had always dreamed of sustainable farming before the cancer took his strength away. We'd talked for maybe 20 minutes about soil composition and crop rotation, a conversation as innocent as Sunday school. "Oh, Bea, you know how Irma gets around young men," replied another voice, this one belonging to Patricia Daniels, whose husband owned the largest construction company in 3 counties. "Remember when she volunteered to help with the youth group camping trip? Always finding excuses to be around those teenage boys." The blood drained from my face so quickly I thought I might faint right there in the cereal aisle. The youth group camping trip had been 2 years ago, and I'd volunteered because they needed an extra chaperone after Mrs. Gregory had to back out due to her mother's illness. I'd spent the entire weekend cooking meals over a camp stove and making sure the kids had clean clothes and bandages for their scraped knees. The closest I'd come to impropriety was giving Jimmy Patterson an extra s'more when he'd scraped his elbow falling off a log. "I heard she's been having men over to her house," Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper that somehow always managed to carry farther than normal conversation. Marge Fielding lives right across the street, and she says there's been a different car in Irma's driveway 3 times this month. Always stays late into the evening. Patricia made a T.S. King sound that conveyed years of practiced moral superiority. And her poor Thomas not even 5 years in the ground. Some women just can't control themselves once they get a taste of freedom. I stood frozen, my knuckles white where they gripped the shopping basket handle. The cars they were talking about belonged to my electrician, my plumber, and my nephew Danny, who'd been helping me fix the back fence that had been damaged in a storm. But facts, apparently, were less interesting than fiction when it came to the church ladies' entertainment. What really concerns me, Beatrice went on, is how she's been dressing lately. Did you see that dress she wore to service last Sunday? Red as sin, and tight enough to show every curve. At her age, really. Some women need to learn when to accept their place in life. The red dress. I'd bought it on impulse during a rare trip to the city, drawn to the deep burgundy color that reminded me of autumn leaves. It was conservative by any reasonable standard, with sleeves that reached my wrists and a hemline that fell well below my knees. But it was new, and it was beautiful, and when I'd put it on that Sunday morning, I'd felt attractive for the first time since Thomas died. I'd felt like myself again, not just a shadow moving through the motions of living. She's probably going through some kind of midlife crisis, Patricia added, with the authority of someone who'd never experienced a day of real hardship in her pampered existence. You know how some women get when they realize their best years are behind them? All that desperation makes them do inappropriate things. The grocery store suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of air that tasted like betrayal and casual cruelty. These women, who I'd served beside for decades, who I'd comforted during their own trials, who I'd considered not friends exactly but sisters in faith, were dissecting my life like it was nothing more than entertainment for their coffee clutches. I set my basket down on the nearest shelf and walked out of that store with as much dignity as I could muster, but inside, something fundamental was shifting. The woman who'd walked into Morrison's grocery that morning, the woman who believed in turning the other cheek and killing them with kindness, was dying one breath at a time. And in her place, something harder and more purposeful was taking root. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands, staring out at the garden Thomas and I had planted together in happier times. The tomatoes were heavy on the vine, red and perfect and ready for harvest, but I couldn't bring myself to care about them. All I could think about were those voices, casual and cruel, shredding my reputation like it was nothing more than old newspaper. This wasn't the first time I'd caught whispers. Over the past few months there had been other incidents. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Invitations that mysteriously failed to reach me. Smiles that didn't quite reach people's eyes when they greeted me after service. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me oversensitive to imagined slights. But now I knew the truth. The church ladies hadn't just been talking about me. They'd been systematically destroying my reputation, one manufactured scandal at a time. The worst part wasn't even the lies themselves. It was the calculated nature of it all, the way they'd taken my attempts to rebuild my life after Thomas's death and twisted them into something ugly and shameful. Every moment of joy I'd tried to reclaim, every small step toward healing, had been catalogued and distorted until it became evidence of my moral failing. I thought about the youth group camping trip, how proud I'd been to help those kids learn about nature and teamwork. I thought about my conversations with Jake Morrison, how refreshing it had been to talk to someone who shared Thomas's passion for sustainable agriculture. I thought about the red dress, how wearing it had made me feel like I was honoring the woman Thomas had fallen in love with all those years ago, instead of hiding her away in widow's weeds. Every single thing they'd used against me had been innocent, pure, born from a heart that was trying to heal and find purpose again. But in the hands of women who had never known real loss, who had never had to rebuild themselves from the ground up, my healing had become their entertainment. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across my kitchen floor, I made a decision that would have horrified the old Irma Sullivan. I was done being the perfect Christian woman. I was done turning the other cheek, I was done letting them tear me apart while they smiled to my face and called it fellowship. It was time to show them what real sin looked like. The next morning, I woke before dawn and did something I hadn't done in 32 years of faithful church attendance. I skipped Sunday service. Instead, I put on my most comfortable clothes, made myself a proper breakfast of pancakes and bacon instead of the usual piece of toast grabbed between getting ready for church, and I started planning. From my kitchen window, I could see cars driving past toward Blessed Redeemer, families dressed in their Sunday best, carrying covered dishes for the potluck lunch that would follow the service. On any other week, I would have been among them, my coffee cake balanced carefully on the passenger seat, my Bible bookmarked with the morning's reading. But not today. Today, I had more important work to do. I pulled out my laptop, the one Danny had taught me to use the previous year, and began researching. If there was one thing I'd learned from 37 years of marriage to a man who built his business from nothing, it was that knowledge was power. And if I was going to take down the women who'd been systematically destroying my life, I needed to know everything about theirs. Beatrice Whitmore was married to Harold Whitmore, who owned Whitmore and Associates, a small accounting firm that handled the books for most of the local businesses in Cedar Falls. They lived in a sprawling colonial on Elm Street, drove matching luxury sedans, and took elaborate vacations to Europe every summer. Beatrice was notorious for her charity work, though her idea of charity seemed to involve a lot of committee meetings at expensive restaurants and very little actual help for the people who needed it. Patricia Daniels was the wife of Big Jim Daniels, whose construction company had built half the houses in the county over the past 2 decades. They owned the largest house in Cedar Falls, a gaudy mansion that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought more was always better. Patricia spent her time shopping, gossiping, and serving on the boards of various social organizations where she could exercise her love of controlling other people. The third member of their little trinity of destruction was Millicent Hayes, whose husband Frank owned Hayes Family Motors, the only car dealership within 50 miles. Millicent was perhaps the most dangerous of the three, because she had perfected the art of concern trolling, framing her cruelest observations as worry for the spiritual welfare of others. All 3 women had something in common beyond their love of gossip and their comfortable lives built on their husband's success. They had never known real hardship. They had never lost someone who was the center of their world. They had never had to rebuild their identity from scratch, while a community they'd served faithfully whispered about their every move. But they were about to learn what it felt like to lose everything. I spent the rest of Sunday researching their husbands' businesses, learning about their client bases, their financial structures, their vulnerabilities. By evening, I had a plan that was so elegant in its simplicity, so perfectly calibrated to hit them where it would hurt most, that I almost scared myself with the thoroughness of it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But then I remembered Beatrice's voice in the grocery store, casual and cruel, reducing my attempts to heal to evidence of my moral corruption. I remembered Patricia's dismissive laughter as she proclaimed that some women needed to learn their place. I remembered every smile that had hidden a knife, every kind word that had been followed by whispered poison. The old Irma Sullivan would have prayed for them. The old Irma Sullivan would have turned the other cheek and trusted God to handle their judgment. But the old Irma Sullivan was dead, and the woman who had taken her place understood that sometimes divine justice needed a human hand to guide it. Monday morning found me in the offices of Cromwell, Steinberg & Associates, the largest law firm in the state capital. I'd driven the 2 hours before dawn, wanting to be there when they opened at 8 o'clock sharp. The receptionist was a young woman with kind eyes who offered me coffee while I waited for my appointment with David Cromwell, the senior partner who specialized in estate planning for high-net-worth clients. Mr. Cromwell was exactly what I'd expected from his website photo. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of handling other people's money. His office was all dark wood and leather, designed to inspire confidence and suggest prosperity. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, rising to shake my hand. I understand you're interested in discussing some charitable giving strategies? I settled into the leather chair across from his massive desk and smiled. Actually, Mr. Cromwell, I'm interested in giving away quite a lot of money. All of it, in fact. His eyebrows rose slightly. I see. And you want to ensure this is handled in the most tax-efficient manner possible? Taxes are the least of my concerns, I said. What I want is to make sure my donations have the maximum possible impact on the organizations I care about and the community I've called home for over 3 decades. Over the next 2 hours, I outlined my plan. Thomas had been more successful than most people knew. He'd invested wisely, saved aggressively, and left me with assets worth just over $4 million. It was more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, especially since my needs were simple and my wants were few. I'd always planned to leave most of it to charity anyway, but I'd been thinking in terms of a bequest after my own death, something distant and abstract. But recent events had clarified my thinking wonderfully. Why wait to do good when I could do it now? Why let money sit in accounts earning interest when it could be changing lives immediately? Of course, I didn't tell Mr. Cromwell about the real motivation behind my sudden urgency to give away my fortune. I simply explained that I'd been doing a lot of thinking since my husband's death, that I'd realized how much good I could do with resources I didn't really need, and that I wanted to make a meaningful impact while I was still alive to see it. He was intrigued but professional, asking all the right questions about my intentions and making sure I understood the irrevocable nature of what I was proposing. By the time I left his office, we had the framework for a charitable foundation that would distribute my entire estate to worthy causes over the next 5 years. But the specific causes I had in mind weren't ones I'd discussed with Mr. Cromwell. Those conversations would happen elsewhere, with people who understood the particular needs of my community and the particular businesses that served it. My next stop was the Cedar Falls Community Development Office, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the town square. Sarah Martinez, the development director, was a smart woman in her early 40s who'd moved to Cedar Falls from Chicago 5 years earlier with big dreams about revitalizing small-town America. She'd made impressive progress, bringing in new businesses and updating the town's infrastructure, but she was always fighting an uphill battle against limited resources and entrenched interests. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, clearly surprised to see me, "what can I do for you?" "I want to talk about economic development," I said. "Specifically about what kinds of businesses our community needs and how we might encourage the right kind of growth." Sarah's eyes lit up. Economic development was clearly her passion, and she spent the next hour showing me charts and graphs and talking about Cedar Falls' potential. The town was perfectly positioned to benefit from the growing trend of people leaving big cities for smaller communities. But it needed more diverse businesses, more employment opportunities, and more services for residents. "The biggest challenge we face," she said, "is that so much of our economy is controlled by just a few established businesses. We need more competition, more innovation, more options for consumers." "What if someone wanted to help with that?" I asked. "What if someone had resources to invest in new businesses, or to help existing businesses expand in ways that would benefit the community?" Sarah leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "Are you thinking about starting a business, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Not exactly," I said. "But I'm thinking about ways to use resources I have access to in order to create the kind of community we all want to live in. A community where competition keeps businesses honest, where innovation is rewarded, and where no one business or family has too much control over everyone else's livelihood." We talked for another hour about specific opportunities. A new accounting firm that could offer more personalized service to small businesses. A construction company that specialized in sustainable building practices and affordable housing. An auto dealership that focused on fuel-efficient vehicles and honest dealing, rather than high-pressure sales tactics. By the time I left Sarah's office, I had a clear picture of exactly what kinds of businesses would most disrupt the comfortable monopolies that certain families had enjoyed for too long. And I had the contacts to make it happen. Tuesday found me in meetings with entrepreneurs from the state capitol, young professionals who were looking for opportunities to start businesses in smaller communities where they could make a real impact. I met with Maria Santos, a certified public accountant, who'd been thinking about leaving her job at a large firm to start her own practice. I met with David Chen, a contractor who specialized in green building techniques and was looking for a community ready to embrace sustainable development. I met with Jennifer Williams, who had extensive experience in automotive sales and had always dreamed of running a dealership that prioritized customer service over profit margins. To each of them, I made the same offer. If they were willing to relocate to Cedar Falls and start businesses that would serve the community's needs, I would provide the startup capital, the first year's operating expenses, and ongoing support through my new foundation. All I asked in return was that they run their businesses with integrity, treat their employees fairly, and charge reasonable prices for quality service. They were intrigued but cautious, wanting to know what the catch was, why someone they'd never met would be willing to invest so heavily in their success. I told them the truth, just not all of it. I explained that I was a longtime resident of Cedar Falls who wanted to see the community thrive, that I had resources I wanted to use for good, and that I believed competition and innovation were essential for a healthy economy. What I didn't tell them was that I also wanted to destroy the comfortable monopolies that had allowed certain families to become so arrogant they thought they could tear apart a widow's reputation for sport. What I didn't mention was that within 6 months, their new businesses would be competing directly with established companies whose owners' wives had made the mistake of underestimating a quiet church lady who'd finally had enough. By Wednesday, I had commitments from all 3 entrepreneurs and a timeline for their businesses to open within the next 4 months. I had contractors lined up to renovate office spaces for them, marketing consultants ready to help them establish their brands, and a lawyer preparing the contracts that would formalize my investment in their success. But the most important conversation happened Wednesday evening, when I drove to the next county over and had dinner with my nephew Danny and his wife Lisa. Danny was Thomas's sister's boy, a good man who'd struggled to make ends meet working construction for Big Jim Daniels. Danny was talented, hardworking, and honest, but Big Jim kept his wages low because he knew Danny didn't have many other options in Cedar Falls. "Aunt Irma," Danny said after we'd finished Lisa's excellent meatloaf and settled in their small living room with coffee, "you sounded kind of mysterious on the phone. What's going on?" I looked at this young man who'd been so kind to me since Thomas's death, who'd fixed my fence without being asked, and who always made sure I had help with anything too heavy or complicated for me to handle alone. Danny deserved better than working for a man who treated his employees like disposable tools. "How would you feel about starting your own construction company?" I asked. Danny nearly choked on his coffee. "What? Aunt Irma, I don't have that kind of money." Starting a construction business takes equipment, insurance, startup capital. What if I told you money wasn't an obstacle? What if I told you I wanted to invest in your future, help you build something that was yours? Lisa leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Irma, what are you talking about?" So I told them. Not about the church ladies or my plans for revenge, but about my foundation and my desire to help people in my community achieve their dreams. I explained that I wanted to invest in Danny's construction company, provide him with everything he needed to compete with the established players in the market. "I know you're honest," I said. "I know you do quality work. I know you treat people fairly. That's exactly the kind of business this community needs." Danny was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with possibility. "You really think I could do this? Compete with Big Jim?" "I think you could bury Big Jim," I said, and I meant every word. "I think you could build houses that last, charge fair prices, and treat your workers so well that every good contractor in the county will want to work for you instead of him." By the time I left their house that night, Danny had agreed to quit his job with Daniels Construction and start Sullivan and Associates Building Company. He would specialize in the kind of honest, quality work that Big Jim had forgotten how to do in his rush to maximize profits and minimize costs. Thursday was spent in more meetings, this time with suppliers and vendors who would be crucial to the success of my new entrepreneurs. I met with equipment dealers, office supply companies, marketing firms, and insurance agents. I negotiated bulk discounts, established credit terms, and made sure that my 3 new businesses would have every advantage possible when they opened their doors. But the most satisfying meeting was with Tom Bradley, who ran the local business association. Tom was a good man who'd been frustrated for years by the lack of competition in Cedar Falls' business community. He was thrilled to hear about the new enterprises coming to town. "This is exactly what we've needed," he said as we sat in his cluttered office above the hardware store he'd inherited from his father. "The Whitmores have had a stranglehold on business accounting for 20 years. Big Jim thinks he can charge whatever he wants because people don't have choices. And don't get me started on Frank Hayes and that car lot of his." "What about Frank Hayes?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. Tom's expression darkened. "Frank Hayes is a crook, plain and simple. He sells lemons, charges interest rates that ought to be illegal, and treats his customers like marks in a con game. Half the people in this county are driving cars that are falling apart because they can't afford to get ripped off by Frank again, and the other half are paying twice what they should for vehicles that aren't worth half what he charges. It sounds like the community could use some competition in the automotive business," I said. "God, yes. Someone honest. Someone who cares more about serving customers than squeezing every penny out of them." Tom paused, studying my face. "You wouldn't happen to know anyone in the car business, would you?" "As a matter of fact," I said, "I might." Friday morning, I was back in Blessed Redeemer Methodist Church for the first time since my revelation in Morrison's grocery. I sat in my usual pew, wearing a navy blue dress that was conservative enough to satisfy even Beatrice Whitmore, my hands folded in my lap, my expression serene. To anyone watching, I looked exactly like the same Irma Sullivan who'd been warming that pew for 32 years. But everything had changed. As I sat through Pastor Henley's sermon about forgiveness and Christian charity, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. As Beatrice led the responsive reading about loving thy neighbor, I wondered how she'd reconcile that with her habit of destroying her neighbors' reputations. As Patricia passed the collection plate with her usual self-satisfied smile, I calculated how much money her husband's business would lose when Danny's company started underbidding him on every major project in the county. After the service, during the fellowship hour in the church basement, I moved through the crowd like I always had, accepting condolences on my loss, complimenting people on their children's achievements, discussing the upcoming church harvest festival. But now I was watching everything differently, seeing the subtle hierarchies and power dynamics that had always been there but that I'd been too naive or too trusting to recognize. Beatrice held court near the coffee table, her voice carrying as she discussed the, quote, concerning moral decline she'd been observing in the community. Patricia nodded along, adding her own observations about people who'd been acting inappropriately. Millicent chimed in with worried comments about the influence such behavior might have on the town's young people. They didn't mention me by name, but the glances in my direction made it clear I was still a primary topic of conversation. I smiled and nodded when people spoke to me, accepted compliments on the apple cinnamon coffee cake I'd brought as if nothing had changed, and all the while I thought about what these women's lives would look like in 6 months when their husbands' businesses were struggling to survive. "Irma, dear," Millicent Hayes said, appearing at my elbow with that concerned expression she'd perfected over decades of practice. "We've missed you these past few weeks. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling wonderful, Millicent," I replied, my smile as warm and genuine as I could make it. "I've been busy with some new projects, but I'm so glad to be back among my church family." "New projects?" Beatrice had materialized on my other side, her radar apparently finely tuned to detect any conversation that might yield gossip. "How exciting! What kind of projects?" "Oh, just some charitable work," I said vaguely. "You know how I am about giving back to the community." "That's so admirable," Patricia said, joining our little circle. "Though I hope you're being careful about who you associate with in your charitable endeavors. There are so many people these days who try to take advantage of generous women like yourself." The irony was so thick I could taste it. Here were 3 women who'd been systematically taking advantage of my generous nature for years, warning me to be careful of people who might take advantage of me. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm very careful about who I trust. Experience has taught me to pay close attention to people's actions rather than their words." Something flickered in Beatrice's eyes, a momentary uncertainty that suggested she might have caught the subtle edge in my voice, but the moment passed, and she was back to her usual self-important demeanor. "Well, you just remember that we're here for you," she said. "We women need to stick together, especially those of us who understand the importance of maintaining proper standards in the community." "Absolutely," I agreed. "We certainly do need to stick together." and maintain proper standards. As I drove home that afternoon, I reflected on how satisfying that conversation had been. Not because I'd gotten revenge or made any dramatic revelations, but because for the first time in months I'd been the one controlling the subtext. I'd been the one with secret knowledge, the one with hidden plans, the one who knew exactly what was coming while they remained blissfully unaware. The tables, as they say, had finally turned. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and Thomas's old business journals, reading about the early days when he was building his company from nothing. He'd written extensively about the challenges of competing with established businesses, about the importance of offering better service at better prices, about the satisfaction of earning customers' loyalty through honest dealing rather than market dominance. The secret, he'd written in one entry that particularly spoke to me, isn't to destroy your competition. It's to be so much better that customers can't imagine doing business with anyone else. When you focus on excellence, your competitors destroy themselves. That was going to be my approach. I wasn't going to attack the Whitmores, the Danielses, or the Hazeys directly. I was simply going to ensure that their customers had better options, that their employees had better opportunities, and that their stranglehold on the local economy was broken by the simple expedient of superior competition. But I would be there to watch when it happened. I would be there to see their comfortable world of casual cruelty and unearned privilege crumble around them. And when they finally understood that their actions had consequences, when they realized that the quiet church lady they'd underestimated had been the architect of their downfall, I would smile the same sweet smile I'd been giving them for 32 years. The only difference would be that this time I would mean it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes in early October, when the air is sharp enough to cut glass and every leaf seems outlined in gold. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sun climb over the rooftops of Cedar Falls, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not the anxious kind that comes with dreading what might happen, but the electric thrill that accompanies knowing exactly what you're going to do and how perfectly it's going to work. Today was the day I would begin dismantling the comfortable little empire that had allowed 3 families to think they could destroy a grieving widow for entertainment. My first stop was the Cedar Falls Diner, a chrome and vinyl throwback to the 1950s that served as the unofficial town hall for anyone who wanted to know what was really happening in the community. Jimmy Peterson, who'd owned the place for 30 years, had always been a friend to Thomas and me, and more importantly, he had no love for the way certain families had been throwing their weight around in recent years. "Irma Sullivan," Jimmy called out when I walked through the door, the bell jingling cheerfully above my head. "Haven't seen you in here for a while. How you been holding up?" "Better than ever, Jimmy," I said, sliding into my usual booth by the window. "In fact, I've got some news that might interest you." Jimmy poured me coffee without being asked, black with 1 sugar, the way I'd been drinking it since Thomas and I first started coming here as newlyweds. "Oh yeah? What kind of news?" I took a sip of the coffee, savoring the bitter warmth, and smiled. "The kind that's going to shake up this town in all the best ways." Over the next hour, I told Jimmy about the new businesses coming to Cedar Falls. Not everything, of course, but enough to get him excited about the possibilities. A new accounting firm that would offer personal service instead of the assembly line approach Harold Whitmore had been using for years. A construction company that would treat workers fairly and charge honest prices. An auto dealership that would focus on customer satisfaction instead of squeezing every penny out of desperate people. "Hot damn," Jimmy said, refilling my coffee cup. "'Bout time someone gave those folks some real competition. You know how many people come in here complaining about getting ripped off by Frank Hayes? And don't get me started on Big Jim Daniels. That man thinks he owns this town." "Well," I said, "they're about to learn that nobody owns Cedar Falls except the people who live here." Jimmy leaned across the table, lowering his voice even though the diner was nearly empty. "You mind me asking how you know all this? These new businesses just deciding to set up shop here out of the blue?" I considered how much to tell him. Jimmy was trustworthy, but he was also the center of the town's gossip network. Anything I said would be all over Cedar Falls by supper time. Which, I realized, was exactly what I wanted. Let's just say I've been working with some investors who believe in supporting communities that are ready for positive change, I said. People with resources who want to see small towns thrive instead of being controlled by a few families who've gotten too comfortable. Jimmy's eyes widened. You talking about outside money? Big city investors? I'm talking about people who understand that healthy competition is good for everyone, except those who've been taking advantage of their neighbors for too long. By the time I left the diner, Jimmy was practically vibrating with excitement. I could already see him working out who he would tell first, how he would frame the story, what details he would emphasize. Within hours, word would start spreading that changes were coming to Cedar Falls, that the old guard was about to face some serious challenges. But I wasn't done planting seeds. My next stop was Rosario's Market, the small grocery store on the south side of town that catered to families who couldn't afford Morrison's higher prices. Elena Rosario had immigrated from Guatemala 20 years earlier and built her business one customer at a time, offering credit to people going through hard times and never forgetting what it was like to struggle. Mrs. Sullivan, Elena said, looking surprised to see me. What brings you to this side of town? I wanted to talk to you about business, I said. Specifically, about how the new companies coming to Cedar Falls might affect yours. Elena's expression grew cautious. Competition was always a threat to small business owners, and she'd worked too hard to build her customer base to lose it to some newcomer with deeper pockets. What new companies? I explained about the construction firm, the accounting office, and the car dealership, watching Elena's face carefully as I spoke. When I mentioned that these would be companies focused on serving working families rather than squeezing maximum profit from every transaction, her expression began to shift from worry to interest. These new businesses, she said slowly, they will hire local people? That's the plan. Good jobs, fair wages, benefits for families. The kind of employment that helps people build stable lives instead of just getting by paycheck to paycheck. Elena nodded thoughtfully. She understood better than most what it meant when working families had a little extra money in their pockets. It meant more customers who could afford to shop for quality instead of just price. It meant people who could pay their bills on time instead of needing credit extensions. It meant a stronger community for everyone. This is good news, she said finally. When will these companies start? Within the next few months. But Elena, I wanted to talk to you first because I think you could benefit in other ways too. I explained that successful business owners often needed reliable vendors for employee lunches, client meetings, and company events. Elena's market included a small deli section, and with some expansion, she could easily cater to the growing business community. You mean I could get contracts with these new companies? I mean you could become the go-to source for business catering in Cedar Falls. All it would take is expanding your kitchen a little, maybe hiring 1 or 2 more people, and positioning yourself as the local alternative to expensive outside caterers. Elena's eyes lit up with the same entrepreneurial fire I'd seen in my meetings with Maria, David, and Jennifer. How much would something like that cost? What if I told you cost wasn't an obstacle? What if I told you I knew people who were interested in investing in local businesses that served their communities well? By the time I left Rosario's Market, Elena was sketching plans for her expansion on the back of a receipt, her mind already racing with possibilities. I'd planted another seed, one that would grow into yet another competitive alternative to the established order that had kept too many people down for too long. But the most important conversation of the day was still ahead of me. Margaret Torres had been the church organist at Blessed Redeemer for 15 years. A quiet woman in her early 50s who worked part-time at the Cedar Falls Public Library and cared for her aging mother at home. She was also one of the most observant people I'd ever met, with an encyclopedic knowledge of who was connected to whom in our small town and a talent for seeing patterns that others missed. I found her in the library's genealogy section, helping an elderly man trace his family history through dusty volumes of county records. When she finished with him, I approached the circulation desk where she was processing returned books. Margaret, do you have a few minutes to talk? She looked around the nearly empty library and nodded. Of course, Mrs. Sullivan, what can I help you with? I'd debated how much to tell Margaret, but ultimately decided that I needed at least one person who understood the full scope of what I was doing. Margaret was discreet, intelligent, and most importantly, she'd been on the receiving end of the church lady's subtle cruelties herself. She knew what it was like to be judged and found wanting by women who'd never faced real hardship. "I need to tell you something in complete confidence," I said. "Something that's going to change quite a few things around here, and I want you to be prepared." Margaret's expression grew serious. "What kind of changes?" So I told her. Not just about the new businesses, but about why I was really bringing them to Cedar Falls. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard in Morrison's grocery, about the months of whispered rumors and manufactured scandals, about the systematic campaign to destroy my reputation that had been masquerading as Christian concern. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing darker with each detail I shared. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the circulation desk. "I'm not surprised," she said finally. "I've seen how they operate. Remember when my mother had her stroke 2 years ago, and I had to miss several church services to be with her at the hospital?" I nodded. Margaret had been dealing with a family crisis, and everyone had understood why she couldn't maintain her usual church schedule. Beatrice Whitmore started a whole campaign about how I was neglecting my church duties, and maybe they needed to find a more reliable organist. Patricia Daniels suggested that my quote family problems were affecting my ability to serve the congregation properly. They made it sound like caring for my dying mother was some kind of character flaw. What happened? Pastor Henley shut it down, thank God, but the damage was done. For months afterward, people treated me like I was on probation, like I had to prove I was still worthy of my position. It was humiliating. Margaret understood exactly what I was going through because she'd been through it herself. The only difference was that she hadn't had the resources to fight back the way I did. "So what's your plan?" she asked. I outlined the business strategy, explaining how the new companies would create competition that would force the established players to improve their practices or lose their market share. I told her about Danny's construction company, about Maria's accounting firm, about Jennifer's car dealership. "Within a year," I said, "Harold Whitmore will either have to start treating his clients like human beings or watch them walk away to someone who will. Big Jim Daniels will either have to pay fair wages and charge honest prices or see his best workers and customers go to Danny. Frank Hayes will either have to stop ripping people off or watch Jennifer's dealership put him out of business. And their wives will have to watch their comfortable little world crumble around them," Margaret said with satisfaction. "The same way they tried to make yours crumble." "Exactly. But Margaret, I need you to know that this is just the beginning. Once these businesses are established and thriving, I have other plans. Plans that will ensure that Beatrice, Patricia, and Millicent understand exactly what they've done and why their actions have consequences." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What kind of plans?" "The kind that will make them remember this lesson for the rest of their lives." That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the maple trees, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Thomas's roses were blooming one last time before winter, their petals soft and fragrant in the cooling air. I could almost feel his presence beside me, could almost hear his voice telling me how proud he was of what I'd accomplished. For 37 years, Thomas had been my partner in everything. He'd taught me about business, about strategy, about the importance of thinking 3 moves ahead of your competition. He'd shown me that success wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive, but about being the smartest and the most prepared. Most importantly, he'd taught me that sometimes the most devastating attacks are the ones your enemies never see coming. The church ladies thought they'd been targeting a helpless widow, a woman with no resources and no allies, someone they could tear down without consequences. They'd mistaken quiet dignity for weakness, Christian charity for foolishness, and grief for vulnerability. They were about to learn just how wrong they'd been. Monday morning brought the first visible signs that change was coming to Cedar Falls. A crew from the state capitol arrived to begin renovating the office space that would house Santos Accounting Services, Maria's new firm. They set up their equipment right across the street from Whitmore and Associates, where Harold had been conducting business from the same cramped, outdated offices for 20 years. I made sure to be downtown that morning, ostensibly to pick up my prescription from the pharmacy, but really to watch the reactions as people noticed the construction activity. The crew had put up professional signs announcing the coming soon opening of a full-service accounting firm, specializing in small business and individual tax services. Harold Whitmore himself appeared on the sidewalk by 10 o'clock, drawn by the noise and curiosity about what was happening across from his office. He stood there for several minutes, studying the signs and watching the workers, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. I happened to be walking by at just that moment, carrying my prescription bag and wearing my most innocent smile. "Good morning, Harold," I said pleasantly. "Exciting to see new businesses coming to town, isn't it?" He turned to me with the kind of forced smile that barely concealed his alarm. "Oh, hello, Irma. Yes, very." "Exciting. Do you know anything about this new accounting firm?" "Just what I've heard around town," I said. "Apparently they specialize in personalized service for small businesses. You know, the kind of attention to detail that some people feel has been missing in our community." Harold's smile became even more strained. "Missing? I think our local businesses have been very well served by the existing options." "Oh, I'm sure they have," I agreed. "But competition is always good for consumers, don't you think? It encourages everyone to do their best work." I could see the wheels turning behind Harold's eyes as he tried to calculate what this new competition might mean for his business. For 20 years, he'd been the only game in town for professional accounting services. He'd been able to charge premium prices for mediocre service because his clients had no alternatives. Now, suddenly, they would. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we'll see how much demand there really is for another accounting firm in a town this size." "I suppose we will," I agreed, and walked away whistling a hymn. The next surprise came Tuesday afternoon, when another crew arrived to begin work on the space that would house Chen Construction Company's offices. This time, the location was even more pointed, directly next door to Daniel's Construction, in a building that Big Jim had been trying to buy for years to expand his own operations. Big Jim appeared within an hour, his face red with anger as he confronted the construction foreman. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Who authorized this work?" The foreman, a professional from the state capitol who clearly wasn't intimidated by small-town bluster, calmly showed Big Jim the permits and contracts. "Chen Construction Company. They're opening a new office here next month." "Chen Construction? Never heard of them. Where are they based?" "They're relocating from the capital. Apparently they see opportunities in smaller communities that value quality workmanship and fair pricing." Big Jim's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "There's already plenty of construction companies serving this area. We don't need any more." "I wouldn't know about that, sir. I just do the renovation work." I watched this exchange from the coffee shop across the street, sipping a latte and enjoying every moment of Big Jim's discomfort. For years, he'd used his size and his temper to intimidate anyone who threatened his position. He'd driven smaller competitors out of business through aggressive bidding and dirty tricks. He'd treated his workers like disposable equipment and his customers like marks to be exploited. Now he was getting his first taste of what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. Wednesday brought the third wave of construction activity, this time at the site of what would become Williams Automotive, Jennifer's new car dealership. The location was perfect, a large lot on the main highway into town, with excellent visibility and easy access. It was also the site that Frank Hayes had been coveting for his own expansion plans, a piece of property he'd been pressuring the elderly owner to sell for months. Frank arrived at the site before the construction crew had even finished unloading their equipment. Unlike Big Jim's explosive anger or Harold's nervous concern, Frank's reaction was calculating and cold. He walked the perimeter of the property, taking pictures with his phone, clearly gathering intelligence about what kind of operation would be setting up shop in his territory. I made sure to drive by the site several times that day, and each time I saw Frank there, studying the plans posted on the construction trailer, talking to workers, trying to piece together what kind of threat he was facing. By Thursday, word had spread throughout Cedar Falls that 3 new businesses were setting up operations in direct competition with the town's most established companies. The reactions varied depending on who was doing the talking. At the diner, Jimmy Peterson was holding court, regaling anyone who would listen with theories about who was behind the sudden influx of new businesses. The consensus among his customers seemed to be that it was about time someone shook things up. 20 years I've been listening to people complain about Harold Whitmore's lousy customer service, said Bob Martinez, who owned a small auto repair shop. Maybe now he'll have to actually return phone calls and explain what he's charging for. And don't get me started on Big Jim, added Carol Stevens, whose husband worked for the county road department. My nephew Danny's been breaking his back for that man for 5 years, and Jim treats him like dirt. Pays him just enough to keep him from quitting, but not enough to get ahead. Frank Hayes sold my daughter a car that broke down 3 times in the first month, contributed Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman whose opinions carried weight throughout the community. When she tried to get him to fix it under warranty, he told her she must have been driving it wrong. Like there's a wrong way to drive to work every day. The conversation continued in this vein for most of the morning, with one person after another sharing stories of poor service, unfair treatment, and arrogant behavior from the 3 families that had dominated Cedar Falls business community for too long. But the most interesting conversations were happening at Blessed Redeemer Methodist Church, where the wives of the threatened businessmen were beginning to realize that their comfortable world was under attack. I learned about these conversations from Margaret Torres, who, as church organist, was privy to all sorts of information that people assumed she either couldn't hear or wouldn't repeat. She called me Thursday evening, her voice tight with barely suppressed amusement. "You need to hear what happened at choir practice tonight," she said. "I'm listening." Beatrice Whitmore cornered Pastor Henley after we finished rehearsing. She wanted to know if he'd heard anything about the new businesses coming to town, and whether the church leadership had any concerns about outside influences disrupting the community. What did Pastor Henley say? He said he thought competition was generally healthy for communities, and that as long as the new businesses operated ethically and contributed to the town's well-being, he saw no reason for concern. I bet that didn't satisfy Beatrice. Not even close. She started going on about how these outside companies might not share, our values, and how important it was to support the families who'd been pillars of the community for generations. She made it sound like opening a competing business was some kind of attack on Christianity itself. What about Patricia and Millicent? Patricia was nodding along with everything Beatrice said, adding comments about how these new businesses probably didn't understand small-town values. Millicent kept making worried faces and talking about how change wasn't always good for communities, especially when it came from people who didn't have deep roots in the area. Did anyone else join the conversation? That's the interesting part. Most of the choir just listened without saying much, but I could tell they weren't buying what Beatrice was selling. Mary Ellen Curtis actually spoke up and said she thought it would be nice to have more choices when it came to getting her taxes done. Janet Williams mentioned that her husband had been saying for years that Big Jim Daniels charged too much for simple home repairs. I smiled, imagining Beatrice's frustration as she realized that her attempt to rally the church community against the new businesses was falling flat. How did she react to that? She got that pinched look she gets when things aren't going her way. Then she made some comment about how people needed to be careful about being swayed by flashy promises from outsiders who might not be around when problems arose. And Pastor Henley? He just smiled and said that faith meant trusting in God's plan, and that if these new businesses were meant to succeed in Cedar Falls, they would, regardless of what anyone thought about it. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, savoring the knowledge that my plan was already working better than I'd dared to hope. The new businesses hadn't even opened their doors yet, and already the established order was beginning to crack. But the real test would come when the new companies actually began operating, when the people of Cedar Falls could see for themselves what it was like to be treated as valued customers instead of necessary nuisances. Friday brought a surprise that I hadn't anticipated, but that fit perfectly into my larger strategy. Danny called me just after lunch, his voice excited and slightly breathless. "Aunt Irma, you're not going to believe what just happened." "Tell me." "I gave Big Jim my notice this morning, told him I was starting my own company. He went ballistic, started yelling about how I was ungrateful and disloyal after everything he'd done for me." "I'm sorry, Danny. I know that must have been difficult." Actually, it felt pretty good. I've been wanting to tell that man what I thought of him for years. But here's the thing. After I left his office, 3 of his other guys came up to me. Good workers, skilled guys who've been putting up with his crap because they needed the jobs. And they want to know if I'm hiring. They're tired of working for someone who treats them like dirt and pays them like they're lucky to have jobs at all. Irma, if I hire these guys, I'll have the best construction crew in the county right from day one. I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Danny was a good man who deserved the chance to build something meaningful. His co-workers were skilled professionals who deserved to be treated with respect. Big Jim Daniels was about to learn what happened when you spend years burning bridges and making enemies. Hire them, I said. All of them. Whatever it takes to get the best people on your team. Are you sure? That's going to increase the startup costs significantly. Danny, the goal isn't to start small and grow slowly. The goal is to hit the ground running with such superior service and quality that every potential customer in the county knows immediately that you're the better choice. Aunt Irma, Danny said quietly, I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity. You can thank me by building the kind of company that makes this community better. Treat your workers fairly, charge honest prices, and do work that you're proud to put your name on. I will. I promise. After I hung up, I realized that this was the moment when my plan stopped being about revenge and started being about something larger. Yes, I wanted the church ladies to face consequences for their cruelty. Yes, I wanted their husbands' businesses to struggle under real competition. But more than that, I wanted Cedar Falls to become the kind of community where good people like Danny could thrive, where customers were treated with respect, where success came from merit rather than market manipulation. That evening, I attended the monthly meeting of the Cedar Falls Historical Society, a group I'd belonged to for years but had been neglecting since Thomas's death. The meeting was held in the basement of the library, in a room lined with old photographs and documents that told the story of our town's past. The agenda was routine: discussions about upcoming events, reports on fundraising efforts, plans for preserving important local landmarks. But what interested me more than the official business were the conversations that happened before and after the meeting, when people gathered in small groups to share news and opinions about what was happening in town. Have you heard about all these new businesses coming to Main Street? Asked Dorothy Chen, an elderly woman whose family had owned the Chinese restaurant for 40 years. My Harold is beside himself, replied Ruth Whitmore, Harold's wife and Beatrice's sister-in-law. He says there's not enough business in this town to support 2 accounting firms. Maybe there would be if the existing firm provided better service, said Dorothy dryly. My brother-in-law waited 3 weeks to get his tax questions answered last spring. 3 weeks! For something that should have taken 1 phone call. Ruth's face flushed with embarrassment, but before she could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Patricia Daniels, who swept into the room wearing a fur coat that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sorry I'm late, she announced loudly. Jim and I were having dinner with the mayor, discussing some concerns about these new businesses that are planning to set up shop in town. She said it like she expected everyone to be impressed by her connection to local power, but the reaction was more subdued than she'd probably hoped for. What kind of concerns? Asked Margaret Torres, who was taking minutes for the meeting. Well, you know how it is when outsiders come into a community, Patricia said, settling into a chair with obvious satisfaction at being the center of attention. They don't understand our way of doing things. They might make promises they can't keep, or bring in practices that don't fit with our values. What values are those? Asked Dorothy Chen, her voice carefully neutral. Patricia seemed taken aback by the question. Well, you know, traditional values. The importance of supporting local families who've been part of this community for generations. These new businesses are hiring local people, pointed out Janet Williams, whose husband worked at the post office. That sounds pretty supportive to me. But for how long? Patricia shot back. What happens when they decide Cedar Falls isn't profitable enough for them? What happens to the people they've hired then? What happens when established businesses take their customers for granted for so long That people stop wanting to do business with them?" Dorothy asked pointedly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia clearly hadn't expected to encounter this level of resistance to her narrative about the threat posed by new competition. I decided it was time to join the conversation. "You know," I said, my voice mild and thoughtful, "it seems to me that the best way to compete with new businesses is to make sure your existing customers are so satisfied that they wouldn't dream of going anywhere else." Patricia turned to me with the kind of smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Of course, Irma, though some of us have been building customer relationships for decades. It's not always easy for newcomers to understand the depth of those connections." "I imagine that's true," I agreed. "Especially when those relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine value rather than simply the absence of alternatives." The meeting officially started before Patricia could respond, but I could see from her expression that she'd caught the subtle challenge in my words. More importantly, I could see from the faces around the room that other people had caught it too, and that they were beginning to think seriously about what real customer service should look like. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. The physical construction of the new businesses was proceeding on schedule, but the psychological construction was happening even faster. People were starting to imagine what it would be like to have real choices, to be treated as valued customers instead of captive audiences. The church ladies were beginning to sense that their comfortable world was under threat, but they didn't yet understand the full scope of what was coming. They were reacting like people who thought they were facing a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental shift in the balance of power. They still didn't know that the quiet widow they'd been tormenting was the architect of their downfall. They still thought they were dealing with outside forces beyond their control rather than consequences they'd brought upon themselves. But they would learn. Soon enough, they would understand that every whispered rumor, every casual cruelty, every moment of smug superiority had been carefully catalogued and was now being repaid with interest. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more thorough and more devastating than they could possibly imagine. The first real earthquake hit on a Monday morning in November, when Maria Santos officially opened the doors of Santos Accounting Services. I made sure to be her very first customer, walking through those gleaming glass doors at exactly 9 o'clock with a folder full of financial documents and a smile that could have powered the entire building. Maria looked nervous but determined in her crisp navy suit, standing behind a reception desk that still smelled of fresh wood polish. Her office was everything Harold Whitmore's wasn't. Bright, modern, welcoming, with comfortable chairs and a coffee station that actually worked. She'd hired 2 local women as assistants, both of whom had previously worked for Harold until his patronizing attitude and outdated practices drove them to seek employment elsewhere. "Mrs. Sullivan," Maria said, coming around the desk to greet me personally. "Thank you so much for being here on opening day. What can I help you with?" I handed her my folder, which contained the financial records for my new foundation along with several years of personal tax information. "I need someone who can handle complex charitable giving strategies and estate planning. Someone who returns phone calls and explains things in language I can understand." Maria's eyes lit up as she reviewed the documents. This was exactly the kind of sophisticated work that Harold Whitmore had been handling poorly for years, treating his clients' complex financial situations like assembly line transactions, rather than unique challenges requiring personalized attention. We spent 2 hours going over my needs, with Maria asking thoughtful questions and providing detailed explanations for every recommendation she made. When we finished, I had a comprehensive plan for managing my foundation's distributions and a tax strategy that would save me thousands of dollars compared to Harold's cookie-cutter approach. But more importantly, I had given Maria Santos the kind of high-profile client that would immediately establish her credibility in the community. Within hours, word would spread that Irma Sullivan, one of the wealthiest widows in Cedar Falls, had chosen the new accounting firm over Harold Whitmore's established practice. As I walked out of Maria's office, I could see Harold across the street, standing at his window and watching the steady stream of people entering and leaving his new competitor's building. His expression was a mixture of confusion and growing panic, like a man who'd just realized that the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he'd thought. I waved cheerfully as I passed his window, and he managed a weak smile in return. Poor Harold. He was about to learn that customer loyalty built on convenience rather than quality was no loyalty at all. Tuesday brought an even more dramatic development when Danny officially launched Sullivan & Associates Building Company with his first major project, renovating the old Masonic Hall into affordable senior housing. The contract was worth nearly $500,000, and Danny had underbid Big Jim Daniels by 30%, while promising better materials and a faster completion schedule. The news hit Cedar Falls like a thunderbolt. For 20 years, Big Jim had been the automatic choice for any significant construction project in the county. His connections with local politicians and his reputation for aggressive bidding had made him virtually unbeatable when it came to securing public contracts. But Danny had advantages that Big Jim couldn't match. He had the best workers in the county, men who'd left Daniels Construction specifically to work for someone who treated them with respect. He had access to better suppliers thanks to the relationships I'd helped him establish. Most importantly, he had a business model based on quality and customer satisfaction rather than cutting corners and maximizing profit margins. The contrast became apparent immediately. While Big Jim's current projects were plagued by delays, cost overruns, and worker complaints, Danny's crew attacked the Masonic Hall renovation with an enthusiasm and professionalism that drew crowds of curious onlookers. I made a point of stopping by the job site every day, ostensibly to check on the progress, but really to be seen supporting my nephew's new venture. Other prominent citizens began doing the same, and within a week, Danny had received inquiries about 3 more major projects. Big Jim's response was predictably explosive. He stormed into the mayor's office demanding to know how an untested upstart had been awarded such an important contract. He accused Danny of underbidding just to steal business, not caring whether he could actually deliver on his promises. He hinted darkly about outside money corrupting the local bidding process, but his complaints fell on deaf ears. Mayor Bradley, who'd been dealing with complaints about Daniels Construction's shoddy work for years, was delighted to finally have an alternative. The city council, tired of Big Jim's arrogant assumption that he deserved every contract regardless of his bid quality, was eager to see what real competition could accomplish. Wednesday saw the opening of Williams Automotive, and Jennifer Williams wasted no time in demonstrating why Frank Hayes' stranglehold on the local car market was about to end. Her grand opening featured fair prices, honest trade-in valuations, and a customer service philosophy that treated car buying as a collaborative process rather than an adversarial negotiation. The contrast with Hayes Family Motors was immediately obvious to anyone who'd ever had the misfortune of dealing with Frank Hayes. Where Frank's lot was cluttered with overpriced vehicles of questionable quality, Jennifer's showroom featured carefully selected cars with transparent pricing and detailed vehicle histories. Where Frank employed high-pressure salesmen who treated customers like marks to be conned, Jennifer hired knowledgeable staff who focused on finding the right vehicle for each customer's needs and budget. But the real killer was Jennifer's financing. While Frank had made his fortune charging usurious interest rates to desperate buyers who had no other options, Jennifer offered competitive rates through relationships with legitimate banks and credit unions. For the first time in decades, Cedar Falls residents could buy reliable transportation without being trapped in predatory loan arrangements. The impact was immediate and devastating to Frank's business model. By Friday, 3 families had walked away from pending deals at Hayes Family Motors to purchase vehicles from Williams Automotive instead. Frank's response was to lower his prices and improve his financing terms, but the damage to his reputation was already done. 20 years of treating customers badly couldn't be erased by a few days of panic-driven reforms. I celebrated these victories quietly, sharing coffee with Margaret Torres at the library and exchanging satisfied glances as we watched the established order of Cedar Falls crumble one customer at a time. But the real satisfaction came from watching the church ladies try to process what was happening to their comfortable world. The first crack in their facade appeared at Thursday evening choir practice, when Beatrice Whitmore's usual confidence gave way to something approaching desperation. Margaret called me afterward with a detailed report that left me smiling into my teacup. Beatrice cornered Pastor Henley again, Margaret said, but this time she wasn't subtle about it. She flat out asked him to say something from the pulpit, about the importance of supporting local businesses that had been serving the community for generations. What did he say? He pointed out that all the new businesses were local now, and that they were hiring local people and contributing to the community. He said the church's role wasn't to pick winners and losers in the marketplace, but to encourage ethical business practices, regardless of who was doing the business. That couldn't have gone over well. Beatrice got that red-faced look she gets when she's about to lose her temper. She started talking about how these outside companies were disrupting the natural order of things, and how some people didn't appreciate the stability that established families brought to the community. Did anyone else join the conversation? That's when it got really interesting. Mary Ellen Curtis spoke up and said she'd just had her taxes done by the new accounting firm, and that they'd caught several errors in her previous returns that had cost her hundreds of dollars in overpaid taxes. Janet Williams mentioned that her son had gotten his car serviced at the new garage attached to Williams Automotive, and that they'd charged half what Frank Hayes usually demanded for the same work. I could picture Beatrice's frustration as she realized that her attempt to rally church support was backfiring spectacularly. How did she respond? She made some snide comment about people being easily swayed by flashy advertising and discount prices. Then Millicent Hayes jumped in with her concerned face, talking about how important it was to consider the long-term implications of choosing convenience over loyalty. And how did that go over? Dorothy Chen asked her what loyalty was worth, if it meant accepting poor service and high prices. She said her family had been loyal customers of Hayes Motors for 15 years, and Frank had rewarded that loyalty by selling her a car that broke down 3 times in the first month, and then refusing to honor his warranty commitments. Margaret's voice carried a note of glee as she continued. By the end of the conversation, half the choir was sharing stories about poor service and unfair treatment they'd received from the established businesses. Beatrice looked like she wanted to crawl under the piano bench. The church ladies' desperation became even more apparent on Sunday, when Beatrice, Patricia, and Millicent launched a coordinated campaign during the fellowship hour after service. They positioned themselves strategically around the church basement, each holding court with different groups of parishioners, and making carefully crafted comments about the importance of community stability and the dangers of change. I watched their performance with the detached interest of a theater critic, noting how their usual subtle approach had given way to increasingly obvious manipulation. Beatrice was talking about how established businesses had earned their place in the community through decades of service. Patricia was expressing concern about what would happen to local employment if the new companies turned out to be fly-by-night operations. Millicent was lamenting the loss of traditional values that came with rapid change. But their message wasn't resonating the way it once would have. Too many people had already experienced the superior service offered by the new businesses. Too many families had saved money or received better treatment than they'd gotten from the established companies. Too many workers had found better employment opportunities with employers who treated them as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. When I walked past Beatrice's little gathering, I could hear her making veiled references to my unfortunate situation and how grief could sometimes lead people to make poor decisions. The implication was clear. My supposed moral failings had somehow led me to support businesses that were threatening the natural order of Cedar Falls society. I paused just long enough to smile warmly at everyone in the group before continuing on my way. Let Beatrice wonder whether I'd heard her comment. Let her worry about what I might be thinking or planning. The truth was so much worse than anything she could imagine. The following week brought developments that pushed the church ladies from concern into full-scale panic. Harold Whitmore lost 3 major clients in 2 days, longtime customers who'd grown tired of his indifferent service and were attracted by Maria Santos's personal attention and competitive pricing. Big Jim Daniels watched 2 of his most lucrative contracts go to Danny's company, jobs he'd considered automatic renewals, until the bidding process revealed how much he'd been overcharging for substandard work. Frank Hayes saw his monthly sales drop by 40% as word spread about Williams Automotive's honest dealing and fair prices. But the real crisis came when Big Jim's remaining workers began demanding better treatment and higher wages, pointing to the superior conditions at Sullivan and Associates as evidence that construction workers didn't have to accept exploitation as the price of employment. When Big Jim refused their demands, 2 more experienced workers quit to join Danny's crew, taking their specialized skills and customer relationships with them. The establishment families were discovering what every monopolist learns eventually. Market dominance built on the absence of competition rather than superior service is inherently fragile. As soon as customers had better options, loyalty evaporated like morning mist. I celebrated these victories by hosting my first dinner party since Thomas's death, inviting Margaret Torres, Elena Rosario, and several other women who'd been targets of the church ladies' subtle cruelties over the years. We gathered in my dining room on a cold December evening, sharing good food and better conversation while snow fell softly outside the windows. "I have to admit," said Elena as she savored my homemade tamales, "when you first told me about the new businesses coming to town, I was worried they might hurt my market. But having more employed people with better wages has been wonderful for business. Families that used to buy just necessities are now able to afford some luxuries." "That's how healthy competition works," I replied. "When businesses have to compete for customers instead of taking them for granted, everyone benefits except those who've been coasting on past success." Margaret raised her wine glass with a knowing smile. "To healthy competition and its beneficial effects on community standards." We toasted, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine or the fireplace. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than judging me for who they thought I should be. These women understood what it meant to rebuild yourself after setbacks, to create opportunities rather than waiting for them to be handed to you. After the other guests left, Margaret and I sat by the fire with coffee and the last of my apple cinnamon cake, watching the flames dance in the fireplace Thomas had built with his own hands 30 years earlier. "They know," Margaret said quietly. "What do they know?" "Not everything, but enough. I heard Beatrice and Patricia talking after service today. They've figured out that you're connected to the new businesses somehow. They don't understand how or why, but they know it's not a coincidence that all this started happening after their little campaign against you." I sipped my coffee, considering this development. I'd known this moment would come eventually. The church ladies weren't stupid, just arrogant. Sooner or later, they would connect the dots between their attacks on me and the systematic dismantling of their husbands' business empires. How are they planning to respond? That's what worries me. Beatrice mentioned something about, quote, taking more direct action, and Patricia nodded like she knew exactly what that meant. "I think they're planning something, Irma. Something more aggressive than their usual whisper campaigns." I set down my coffee cup and turned to face Margaret fully. "Let them come. I've been playing defense for months, absorbing their attacks and turning the other cheek like a good Christian woman should. But if they want to escalate this conflict, they're going to discover that I've learned a few things about playing offense." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything they've done so far has been about destroying my reputation through gossip and innuendo. But I have access to something much more powerful than rumor mills and church basement conspiracies. Which is the truth. The documented, provable, legally actionable truth about how their husbands have been conducting business for the past 20 years. I went to my desk and retrieved a thick folder I'd been building since the day I decided to take these people down. Inside were copies of contracts, financial records, employee complaints, and customer testimonials that painted a devastating picture of systematic fraud, labor violations, and consumer abuse. Harold Whitmore has been systematically overcharging clients for services that junior employees actually perform, I said, spreading documents across the coffee table. He's been billing professional rates for work done by clerks and interns, and he's been claiming tax deductions for his clients that would trigger audits if the IRS knew about them. Margaret leaned forward, studying the papers with growing amazement. Big Jim Daniels has been using substandard materials while charging for premium products, I continued, producing another set of documents. He's been paying workers below minimum wage by classifying them as independent contractors. And he's been violating safety regulations on every job site for the past 5 years. How did you get all this? Former employees who were tired of being complicit in fraud. Current employees who were afraid to speak up until they had somewhere safe to go. Customers who'd been keeping records of their mistreatment but didn't know what to do with them. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I was most proud of obtaining. And Frank Hayes has been running what amounts to a loan sharking operation disguised as an auto dealership. He's been charging interest rates that exceed state limits, repossessing cars from customers who were current on their payments, and selling vehicles he knew had serious mechanical problems without disclosing the defects. Margaret sat back in her chair, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd uncovered. This isn't just about business competition anymore, is it? This is about actual crimes. This is about 20 years of treating people badly because they thought they could get away with it, I said, gathering the documents back into their folder. It's about 3 families who got so comfortable with their market dominance that they forgot they were supposed to be serving their community instead of exploiting it. What are you going to do with all this? I smiled, feeling the same cold satisfaction I'd experienced when I first overheard those women in the grocery store. That depends on what Beatrice, Patricia, and Millicent decide to do next. If they're content to watch their husbands' businesses fail through honest competition, I'll let sleeping dogs lie. But if they want to escalate this into something more personal, you'll destroy them completely. I'll give them exactly what they deserve. Nothing more, nothing less. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful and slightly awed. You know, when this all started, I thought you were just getting revenge for the way they'd treated you. But this is bigger than that, isn't it? This is about cleaning up the corruption that's been holding this community back for decades. Revenge was how it started, I admitted. But you're right, it's become something larger. Cedar Falls deserves better than being controlled by 3 families who think their wealth and connections put them above the law. People deserve honest businesses that compete on merit rather than market manipulation. And if they can't accept that, then they'll learn what happens when you mistake patience for weakness and kindness for stupidity. The next morning brought news that confirmed Margaret's warning about escalation. I was enjoying my coffee and reading the local newspaper when the phone rang. Danny's voice was tight with anger and concern. Aunt Irma, we've got a problem. Someone called in an anonymous tip to the building inspector, claiming that we're not following safety protocols on the Masonic Hall job. Are you following safety protocols? To the letter and beyond. We're exceeding every requirement because I want this first job to be absolutely perfect. But the inspector has to investigate every complaint. And this is going to slow us down and cost us money. Any idea who might have made the call? The inspector wouldn't say, but one of my guys overheard Big Jim Daniels bragging at Murphy's bar last night about how certain people were about to learn what happened when they bit off more than they could chew. I felt my anger flare, cold and precise. This was exactly what Margaret had warned me about. The church ladies had moved beyond whisper campaigns, and were now using their husbands' connections to attack my allies directly. Don't worry about the inspection, I told Danny. You're doing everything right, so the inspector will find nothing wrong. But this is probably just the beginning. Be prepared for more harassment, more anonymous complaints, more attempts to disrupt your work. What should I do? Document everything. Keep detailed records of every delay, every false complaint, every attempt to sabotage your projects. And keep doing excellent work. The best response to their harassment is to succeed so spectacularly that their attacks become obviously desperate and petty. After I hung up with Danny, I called Maria Santos and Jennifer Williams. Both had received visits from various city officials, responding to anonymous complaints about zoning violations, tax irregularities, and licensing issues. In each case, the complaints were baseless, but the investigations were time-consuming and expensive. The pattern was clear. The church ladies had convinced their husbands to use their political connections to wage bureaucratic warfare against the new businesses. They were betting that harassment and delays would discourage my entrepreneurs and convince them to give up their Cedar Falls ventures. They were about to learn just how badly they'd miscalculated. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls to contacts I'd developed over the past few months. David Cromwell, my lawyer, was very interested to hear about the coordinated harassment campaign being waged against legitimate businesses. Sarah Martinez at the Community Development Office was outraged that city resources were being used to protect established monopolies from honest competition. But the most important call was to Amanda Richardson, an investigative journalist from the state capitol who'd been looking for a story about small-town corruption. I'd met Amanda through my research into the new businesses, and she'd expressed interest in Cedar Falls' economic development efforts. "Mrs. Sullivan," Amanda said when I reached her, "I was hoping you'd call. I've been hearing some interesting things about what's happening in your town." "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggests certain established families aren't taking kindly to new competition. I've got sources telling me about harassment campaigns, abuse of city inspection processes, and coordinated efforts to drive new businesses out of town." "And what do you plan to do with that information?" "Write the kind of story that ends political careers and sends people to prison if the evidence supports the allegations." I smiled, feeling pieces fall into place like tumblers in a lock. "Amanda, I think it's time we had a face-to-face conversation. I may have some information that would be useful for your story." We arranged to meet the following day at a restaurant in the next county, far enough from Cedar Falls to ensure privacy but close enough for me to drive easily. As I hung up the phone, I felt the satisfaction of someone who just moved her queen into position for checkmate. The church ladies thought they were escalating the conflict. What they'd actually done was give me the justification I needed to move from economic competition to complete annihilation. By tomorrow evening, Amanda Richardson would have copies of every document in my folder, along with contact information for every witness who could corroborate the allegations. Within a week, her investigation would be making headlines across the state. And within a month, Beatrice Whitmore, Patricia Daniels, and Millicent Hayes would understand that when you declare war on someone, you'd better make sure you can win it. Because I was about to show them what total victory looked like. The restaurant Amanda Richardson chose was one of those anonymous chain establishments that dot highway exits across America. All beige walls and generic comfort food designed to offend no one and inspire nothing. Perfect for a conversation that would topple the carefully constructed facade of Cedar Falls' business elite. Amanda was already waiting when I arrived, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair that she wore like a badge of honor. She'd ordered coffee and was reviewing notes on a tablet, the picture of professional competence. When she looked up and smiled, I could see the predatory intelligence that had made her one of the state's most feared investigative reporters. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, rising to shake my hand. "Thank you for driving all this way. I have to say, your phone call yesterday was intriguing. Please, call me Irma. And I hope what I have to show you will be more than intriguing." I settled into the booth across from her and opened the briefcase I'd brought, the one that contained months of careful documentation. Amanda's eyes widened as I began laying out papers. Contracts with falsified material specifications, payroll records showing illegal wage practices, financial statements that revealed systematic tax fraud. "This is just the beginning," I said quietly, watching her expression grow more serious with each document. "What you're looking at represents 20 years of systematic fraud, corruption, and abuse that's been hidden behind a facade of community respectability." Amanda picked up a contract from Big Jim Daniels' files, one that showed him billing the county for premium concrete while actually using substandard materials that would begin deteriorating within 5 years. "Where did you get this?" Former employees who couldn't stomach being complicit in fraud anymore. Current workers who were afraid to speak up until they had protection. Customers who'd been keeping their own records but didn't know what agency to report to. She studied the payroll records next, documents that showed Harold Whitmore classifying full-time employees as part-time contractors to avoid paying benefits while requiring them to work 50-hour weeks. "This is a Department of Labor violation, multiple violations actually. And that's just Harold. Wait until you see what Frank Hayes has been doing with his financing agreements." I handed her a folder containing loan documents that would make a payday lender blush. Interest rates that exceeded state maximums, repossession clauses that violated consumer protection laws, and mandatory insurance policies that kicked back commissions to Frank's shell companies. Amanda was silent for several minutes, reading through the documents with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of excitement and disgust. "Irma, this isn't just a story about small-town corruption. This is a federal case. Wire fraud, tax evasion, racketeering. The FBI is going to be very interested in what you've uncovered." I was hoping you'd say that. "But I have to ask why you're bringing this to me instead of going directly to law enforcement." With evidence this solid, any prosecutor would jump at the chance to build cases against these people. I'd been expecting this question and had prepared my answer carefully. The truth was too complicated for a woman who didn't understand the social dynamics of small-town life, the way reputation and relationships could be weaponized as effectively as any legal document. Because prosecution alone won't fix the cultural problems that allowed this corruption to flourish, I said. Cedar Falls needs to understand how these families used their social position to insulate themselves from consequences. People need to see that wealth and church membership don't put anyone above the law. And you think a newspaper investigation will accomplish that better than criminal charges? I think both are necessary. Your story will prepare the community for what's coming and help them understand that this isn't about personal vendettas or business competition. It's about holding people accountable for decades of treating their neighbors like marks to be exploited. Amanda nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. You're not just seeking justice. You're engineering a complete transformation of how power works in your community. Exactly. And that requires more than just sending a few people to prison. It requires showing everyone that the old ways of doing business are finished forever. We spent the next 3 hours going through every document in my collection, with Amanda asking probing questions about sources, timelines, and corroborating evidence. By the time we finished, she had enough material for a multi-part series that would dominate headlines for weeks. I'll need to verify everything independently, she said as we prepared to leave. But if even half of this checks out, you've just handed me the biggest story of my career. How long will your investigation take? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I want to interview every source, check every document, and make sure the story is bulletproof before we publish. When this hits, there's going to be a lot of powerful people looking for ways to discredit it. What do you need from me? Just stay available in case I have follow-up questions. And Irma? She paused, studying my face carefully. Be careful. When people realize what's coming, they might get desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. I drove home through the December darkness, snow beginning to fall in the kind of gentle, persistent way that promised a white Christmas. The radio played old carols, songs about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, and I found myself humming along despite the irony. There would be no peace for the families who'd controlled Cedar Falls for so long. There would be no goodwill for people who'd treated their community like a personal fiefdom. But for everyone else, for the honest workers and loyal customers who'd been exploited for decades, there would finally be justice. The first sign that word was leaking came on Wednesday, when Mayor Bradley called to invite me for coffee. We met at the new cafe that had opened next to Williams Automotive, a cozy place with exposed brick walls and locally roasted coffee that had quickly become a gathering spot for people who appreciated quality over convenience. Irma, the mayor said after we'd settled into a corner table with our drinks, I've been hearing some interesting rumors lately. Stories about investigations, journalists asking questions, federal agencies getting involved in local business practices. Rumors can be dangerous things, I replied carefully. People should be careful about what they believe without evidence. Indeed, they should. But some rumors are more credible than others, especially when they come from people who've built their careers on getting the facts right. Mayor Bradley was a smart man who'd been navigating small-town politics for 20 years. He understood that information was currency, and that staying ahead of developing stories was essential for political survival. I imagine that if such investigations were taking place, he continued, certain people might be feeling rather anxious about their futures. I imagine they might. And if such people were feeling anxious, they might be inclined to do something rash. Something that could make their situations considerably worse. I sipped my coffee, considering his words. Are you warning me about something specific, Mayor Bradley? I'm suggesting that when powerful people feel cornered, they sometimes forget that their actions have consequences. They might think that intimidating witnesses or destroying evidence would solve their problems, not realizing that such behavior only confirms their guilt. And you're telling me this because? Because I've spent 20 years trying to clean up this town's government, and I won't stand by while certain families try to drag us all down with them. If they're planning something stupid, I want them to know that the city administration won't protect them. I felt a surge of gratitude for this decent man who was choosing principle over political convenience. I appreciate the warning, Mayor Bradley, and I want you to know that whatever happens in the coming weeks, it's about justice, not politics. It's about making sure that everyone in Cedar Falls gets treated fairly, regardless of their bank account or family connections. That's all any of us can ask for. The mayor's warning proved prophetic. Thursday evening brought the kind of escalation that confirmed just how desperate the established families had become. I was reading in my living room when the doorbell rang, an unexpected sound at 9 o'clock on a snowy night. Through the peephole, I could see 3 figures standing on my porch. Beatrice Whitmore, Patricia Daniels, and Millicent Hayes, bundled in expensive coats and wearing expressions of grim determination. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out over caution, and I opened the door with my most innocent smile. "Ladies," I said pleasantly, "what brings you out on such a cold night?" "We need to talk," Beatrice said without preamble. "May we come in?" I stepped aside and gestured them into my living room, noting how they arranged themselves like a tribunal, with Beatrice in the center and the other 2 flanking her like backup singers. Their body language was aggressive, confrontational, completely different from their usual facade of Christian concern. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered. "Tea?" "This isn't a social call," Patricia said sharply. "We know what you've been doing, Irma. We know you're behind the problems our families have been facing." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't play innocent with us," Millicent snapped, her mask of gentle worry completely discarded. These new businesses didn't just happen to choose Cedar Falls. Someone brought them here. Someone with money and influence. Someone with a grudge. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one Thomas had given me for our 10th anniversary, and regarded them with calm interest. After months of whispered attacks and subtle sabotage, they were finally showing their true faces. "You think I have a grudge?" I asked mildly. "We think you've been carrying on inappropriately since Thomas died," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We think your grief has affected your judgment and led you to make some very poor decisions." "What kind of poor decisions?" "The kind that involve spending time with men half your age," Patricia added. "The kind that involve drawing attention to yourself in ways that aren't becoming for a woman of your age and position." "And now," Millicent continued, "we think those poor decisions have led you to involve yourself in business matters you don't understand, with people who are using you to attack families that have been pillars of this community for generations." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. Here they were, sitting in my living room after months of character assassination, trying to lecture me about appropriate behavior and community values. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You believe that my inappropriate behavior has somehow led to increased business competition in Cedar Falls?" "We believe," Beatrice said carefully, "that certain people have taken advantage of your emotional state to convince you to support ventures that are harmful to the community's stability. And you've come here tonight to do what exactly? Save me from my own poor judgment?" The 3 women exchanged glances, and I could see them recalibrating their approach. They'd expected me to be defensive, apologetic, eager to make amends for whatever transgressions they accused me of. Instead, they were facing someone who seemed genuinely amused by their intervention. "We've come to offer you a way out," Patricia said finally. "A chance to step back from whatever arrangements you've made before things go too far." "Too far toward what?" "Toward consequences that none of us want to see," Millicent said ominously. "Cedar Falls is a small town, Irma. People talk. Reputations matter. When this is all over, you'll still have to live here, still have to face your neighbors every day." The threat was unmistakable, even wrapped in their usual language of concern and community responsibility. They were offering me a chance to surrender before they escalated their campaign against me to new levels of cruelty. "And what would stepping back involve?" I asked. "Convincing your new business friends to relocate somewhere else," Beatrice said. "Helping them understand that Cedar Falls isn't the right market for their particular approaches to commerce." "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for putting this whole unfortunate episode behind us," in exchange for returning to the peaceful community relationships we've all enjoyed for so many years. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow falling on the garden Thomas and I had planted together. Behind me, I could hear the three women shifting uncomfortably, uncertain how to interpret my silence. When I turned back to face them, I was no longer smiling. "You want to know what I think?" I said quietly. "I think you're terrified. I think you've finally realized that your comfortable little world is collapsing, and you're desperate to find someone to blame besides yourselves." Beatrice's face flushed red. "Now see here, Irma." "No, you see here," I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made all three women stiffen. "For months you've been spreading lies about me. You've turned my grief into entertainment, and my attempts to rebuild my life into evidence of moral failing. You've made me the subject of whispered conversations and knowing looks, all while pretending to be concerned for my spiritual welfare." "We were concerned," Millicent protested weakly. "You were bored. Three privileged women, with nothing better to do than tear down someone who was trying to heal from the worst loss of her life." Patricia started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "But here's what you never understood," I continued. "I wasn't some helpless widow you could torment for your amusement. I was a woman with resources, connections, and a very good memory for the way people treat me when they think I'm powerless." "What are you saying?" Beatrice demanded. "I'm saying that everything that's happening to your husband's businesses is a direct result of the choices you made. Every lost contract, every departed employee, every dissatisfied customer is a consequence of your decision to make me your enemy." The three women stared at me in shock, finally understanding that their months of subtle warfare had not gone unnoticed or unanswered. "You can't prove that," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But I think you'll find that other people are very interested in proof. People with badges and subpoena power and the authority to investigate exactly how your families have been conducting business for the past 20 years. Millicent went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your husband's idea of business ethics makes loan sharks look respectable. I'm talking about fraud, embezzlement, labor violations, and consumer abuse that's been hidden behind a facade of community respectability for decades." "You're bluffing," Beatrice said, but her voice shook. "Am I?" Ask Harold about the clients he's been overcharging for services performed by unqualified staff. Ask Jim about the substandard materials he's been using while billing for premium products. Ask Frank about the illegal interest rates and fraudulent insurance schemes he's been running through his dealership. The three women looked like they'd been slapped. For the first time in their privileged lives, they were facing someone who had more power than they did. Someone who'd been planning their downfall while they congratulated themselves on their subtle cruelties. "What do you want?" Beatrice asked finally. "Justice. Accountability. A community where success comes from serving people well, rather than exploiting their lack of alternatives. And what does that mean for our families? That depends on how they respond when the investigations begin. Cooperation and restitution might result in reduced sentences. Obstruction and denial will result in the full weight of the law." I walked to the front door and opened it, cold air rushing in along with swirling snowflakes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an early morning tomorrow. I'm meeting with some very interesting people who have questions about Cedar Falls business practices." The three women filed out in stunned silence, their comfortable world of gossip and social manipulation replaced by the harsh reality of consequences they'd never imagined possible. As I watched them drive away into the snowy night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the hollow calm of resignation, but the deep satisfaction of someone who'd fought for justice and won. Friday morning brought a development that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Amanda Richardson called just after breakfast, her voice crackling with excitement. "Irma, you need to see the morning news. Channel 8 is running a breaking story about federal investigators arriving in Cedar Falls to examine, quote, allegations of systematic business fraud involving several prominent local families." I turned on my television to find a young reporter standing in front of City Hall, snow falling behind her as she described how FBI agents had arrived overnight to begin serving search warrants and interviewing potential witnesses. Sources tell us that the investigation centers on 3 longtime Cedar Falls businesses: Whitmore and Associates accounting firm, Daniels Construction Company, and Hayes Family Motors. Federal agents have seized financial records and computer equipment from all 3 companies, and several employees have been taken in for questioning. The camera cut to footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of Harold Whitmore's office, while a crowd of curious onlookers gathered across the street. The reporter's voice continued over the images. This investigation appears to be the result of a months-long inquiry by this station's investigative team, working in cooperation with federal authorities to expose what sources describe as, quote, systematic fraud and corruption that has been hidden for decades behind a facade of community respectability. I smiled, recognizing Amanda's carefully chosen words. She'd managed to break the story while protecting my identity and positioning her reporting as the catalyst for federal action. The phone began ringing almost immediately. Margaret Torres called first, her voice breathless with excitement. "Irma, are you watching the news? They're arresting people." "I'm watching," I said calmly. "This is incredible. 20 years I've been watching these families act like they owned this town, and now they're being led away in handcuffs." Danny called next, his voice tight with concern. "Aunt Irma, are you okay? With everything that's happening, I wanted to make sure you felt safe." "I'm fine, Danny. Better than fine, actually. Do you think this will affect our business? With all the attention on construction companies, people might be nervous about hiring anyone in the industry." "Danny, I think you're about to become the most popular contractor in 3 counties. When people see the difference between honest business practices and criminal fraud, they'll want to work with someone they can trust." Maria Santos called an hour later, her voice a mixture of relief and vindication. "Mrs. Sullivan, my phone hasn't stopped ringing since the news broke. Apparently, half of Harold's clients are looking for a new accountant immediately. Are you prepared to handle that kind of volume? I've already called in favors from 2 colleagues in the Capitol. We're setting up a temporary expansion to make sure everyone gets the service they deserve." But the most satisfying call came from Elena Rosario, whose small market had become an unofficial gathering place for people trying to process what was happening in their community. "Mrs. Sullivan," Elena said, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. My customers are talking about feeling hopeful for the first time in years. They're saying maybe Cedar Falls can be the kind of place where honest people can succeed." "That's all any of us ever wanted, Elena." The weekend brought a parade of revelations as Amanda Richardson's investigation unfolded across multiple news cycles. Saturday's headlines focused on the scope of the fraud. Harold Whitmore's systematic billing irregularities had cost clients hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past decade. Big Jim Daniels' use of substandard materials had created structural problems in dozens of buildings throughout the county. Frank Hayes' predatory lending practices had trapped hundreds of families in cycles of debt that would take years to resolve. Sunday's coverage shifted to the human impact of the crimes. Interviews with cheated customers, exploited workers, and community leaders painted a picture of systematic abuse, enabled by the absence of competition and accountability. But the story that resonated most powerfully was Amanda's profile of the, quote, anonymous whistleblower, who had provided the evidence that made the investigation possible. Without revealing my identity, she painted a picture of someone who had carefully documented years of abuse while building a network of sources and allies committed to justice. "This wasn't a case of an angry customer seeking revenge," Amanda wrote. "This was a methodical campaign by someone who understood that real change required more than complaints or protests. It required patience, planning, and the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors could use to build airtight cases." I read the article in my kitchen Sunday morning, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a life rebuilt from grief and loss. Outside my window, snow continued to fall on the garden Thomas and I had planted, covering everything in pristine white that promised a fresh start. The phone rang as I finished my coffee, and I recognized the number immediately. Pastor Henley's voice was gentle but concerned when I answered. "Irma, I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday morning. I wanted to check on you with everything that's been happening in town." "I'm doing well, Pastor. Thank you for asking. I have to admit, I'm struggling with how to address all this from the pulpit. My congregation is divided between those who feel vindicated and those who feel betrayed. Some people are angry that these crimes went undetected for so long. Others are defensive about neighbors they thought they knew. What does your faith tell you about justice, Pastor?" "That it's essential, but that it should be tempered with mercy and forgiveness." "And what about accountability? What about making sure that people face consequences for their actions?" Pastor Henley was quiet for a moment. "I think accountability is how we show love for our community. When we allow harmful behavior to continue unchecked, we become complicit in the harm. Then perhaps your sermon should focus on that. On the idea that real love sometimes requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable revelations." "You know, Irma, I've been pastor of this church for 15 years, and I've always admired your quiet strength. But lately I've sensed something different in you, something that suggests you understand these events better than most people." I considered how much to tell him. Pastor Henley was a good man who'd tried to stay above the petty politics and social hierarchies that defined much of Cedar Falls' social life. He deserved honesty, but he also deserved protection from knowledge that might compromise his position. "I understand that sometimes good people have to make hard choices," I said finally. "I understand that turning the other cheek doesn't always prevent further harm, and that sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is ensure that justice prevails." "And you believe justice is prevailing now?" "I believe that people are finally being held accountable for treating their neighbors as opportunities to be exploited, rather than human beings deserving of respect." "Then I'll pray for wisdom in addressing these revelations, and for healing in our community once the truth has been fully revealed." After I hung up with Pastor Henley, I spent the rest of Sunday in quiet reflection, thinking about the journey that had brought me from grieving widow to architect of justice. The woman who'd been devastated by whispered cruelties in a grocery store 6 months ago felt like a different person. Someone smaller and more fragile than the woman who'd orchestrated the downfall of 3 criminal enterprises. But perhaps that wasn't quite right. Perhaps I hadn't become a different person so much as I'd rediscovered who I'd always been underneath the layers of accommodation and people-pleasing that small-town life had required. Perhaps Thomas's death had simply freed me to be the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago, someone who understood the difference between kindness and weakness, between forgiveness and enabling. As evening approached, I lit a candle in the window, a tradition Thomas and I had started during our first winter in this house. The flame flickered against the glass, small but steady, pushing back the darkness one photon at a time. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new arrests, new reckoning for people who'd thought their wealth and connections put them above consequences. But tonight, I was simply Irma Sullivan, sitting in the home she'd shared with the love of her life, watching snow fall on a world that was finally, slowly, becoming a little more just. The church ladies had wanted to destroy me with their whispers and their manufactured scandals. Instead, they'd awakened something in me that they never could have anticipated, the realization that I had more power than they'd ever imagined, and that I wasn't afraid to use it. Justice, it turned out, was the sweetest revenge of all. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls like a resurrection, bringing with it the kind of fresh possibilities that only come after a hard winter has finally ended. I stood in my garden on the first truly warm day of March, watching new growth push through the soil where Thomas and I had planted bulbs during happier times. The daffodils were blooming with an almost defiant cheerfulness, their bright yellow faces turned toward a sun that seemed to shine more brightly on a town finally free from the shadows of corruption. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and Cedar Falls had transformed in ways both visible and profound. The courthouse steps where Harold Whitmore, Big Jim Daniels, and Frank Hayes had been led away in handcuffs had become something of a pilgrimage site for people from neighboring communities who wanted to see where justice had finally prevailed. Tour buses occasionally stopped at the spots where the 3 fraudulent businesses had once operated, their guides telling stories about how federal investigators had uncovered decades of systematic criminal activity hidden behind facades of respectability. But the real changes weren't in the tourist attractions or the news coverage that had made Cedar Falls briefly famous. The real transformation was in the lives of ordinary people, who no longer had to accept exploitation as the price of living in a small town. Danny's construction company had grown from a startup venture to the premier building contractor in 3 counties, his reputation for honest dealing and quality work spreading faster than any advertising campaign could have managed. He'd hired 17 employees, all of them earning wages that allowed them to support their families with dignity, rather than merely survive paycheck to paycheck. The houses and buildings his crew constructed had become showcases of what was possible when craftsmen took pride in their work, instead of cutting corners to maximize profit margins. Maria Santos had expanded her accounting practice twice, bringing in partners from the state capital to help serve the flood of clients seeking honest financial advice from someone who treated them as valued customers rather than necessary inconveniences. Her success had attracted other professional service providers to Cedar Falls, creating a cluster of businesses that competed on merit rather than market manipulation. Jennifer Williams had become something of a legend in the automotive industry, her dealership model studied by business schools as an example of how customer service and transparent pricing could revolutionize even the most traditionally predatory industries. People drove hundreds of miles to buy cars from someone who treated them fairly, and her success had forced every other dealer in the region to improve their practices or lose customers to competitors who actually cared about their reputations. Elena Rosario had transformed her small market into a thriving catering business that served the growing community of ethical enterprises, her success inspiring other immigrant entrepreneurs to believe that hard work and integrity could triumph over established privilege and institutional bias. The ripple effects extended far beyond the businesses I directly supported. The vacuum left by the fallen monopolies had created opportunities for dozens of smaller enterprises run by people who'd never had a chance to compete when the market was rigged against them. Cedar Falls had become a destination for ethical entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses in communities that valued fairness over exploitation. But perhaps the most satisfying change was in the social dynamics that had once made my life miserable. The church ladies who'd thought they could destroy me with whispered cruelties had discovered that their own reputations were far more fragile than they'd imagined. Beatrice Whitmore had left town the week after Harold's sentencing, moving to her sister's house in Florida with the explanation that she needed to be closer to family during this difficult time. The truth, as everyone knew but no one said aloud, was that she couldn't bear the humiliation of facing neighbors who now knew exactly what kind of person she really was. Her departure had been swift and thorough, leaving behind only a forwarding address and a house that sold for far less than she'd hoped. Patricia Daniels had tried to maintain her position in Cedar Falls society, but found herself increasingly isolated as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal surrounding her husband's criminal enterprise. She'd attempted to reinvent herself as a victim of Jim's deceptions, claiming she'd known nothing about his fraudulent business practices. But too many people remembered her arrogant assumption that wealth and social position put her above criticism, and her attempts at sympathy fell on deaf ears. She'd eventually taken a job at a department store in the state capital, the kind of retail work she'd once considered beneath her dignity. Millicent Hayes had perhaps suffered the most complete fall from grace. Her husband's predatory lending practices had trapped so many local families in cycles of debt that she'd become a pariah in her own community. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, church committees politely declined her offers to volunteer, and social events that had once revolved around her calendar proceeded without her involvement. She'd retreated into a bitter isolation, sustained only by the kind of resentment that comes from finally facing consequences for a lifetime of cruelty. The 3 women who'd thought they could tear me down for entertainment had learned that destroying someone's reputation was a game that could be played by more than one side, and that some players were better at it than others. But my own transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The quiet church lady who'd absorbed their attacks with Christian forbearance had evolved into something they'd never anticipated. A woman who understood that sometimes the most moral thing you could do was ensure that immoral people faced appropriate consequences. I'd become a different kind of pillar in the Cedar Falls community, someone people turned to not for gossip or social positioning, but for guidance on how to build businesses and relationships based on integrity rather than advantage. Young entrepreneurs sought my advice on ethical practices. Established business owners asked for help in reforming their own operations before they attracted the kind of scrutiny that had destroyed their predecessors. My foundation had grown beyond its original purpose of supporting competitive businesses to become a force for comprehensive community development. We funded educational programs that taught ethical business practices. We supported legal aid organizations that helped exploit victims seek restitution. We sponsored community events that celebrated achievement based on merit rather than wealth or social connections. The house that had once felt haunted by whispered accusations and social isolation had become a gathering place for people who wanted to build something better. My dining room regularly hosted meetings of the Cedar Falls Business Ethics Council, an organization we'd founded to ensure that the community never again fell victim to the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished for so long. Margaret Torres had become my closest collaborator in these efforts, her keen intelligence and detailed knowledge of community dynamics making her invaluable in identifying both opportunities and potential problems. She'd left her part-time library position to become the Foundation's full-time executive director, finally able to use her considerable talents in work that made a meaningful difference. On this particular spring morning, as I tended the roses Thomas had planted for our 20th anniversary, Margaret arrived with coffee and the kind of news that still gave me deep satisfaction. "The last of the civil suits settled yesterday," she said, settling into one of the garden chairs we'd placed beneath the old oak tree. "Frank Hayes agreed to pay full restitution to everyone who was overcharged or defrauded by his financing schemes. How much did that come to? Just over $2 million. Combined with the settlements from Harold and Jim's cases, we're looking at nearly $5 million in restitution going back to the people who were cheated." I smiled, thinking about families who would finally be able to escape debt traps they'd never deserved, workers who would receive back pay they'd earned but never been given, customers who would be compensated for shoddy work and fraudulent billing. Any word on the prison sentences? Harold got 8 years for tax fraud and embezzlement. Jim got 12 for the construction fraud and labor violations. Frank got 15 for the racketeering charges related to his loan sharking operation. And their appeals? Going nowhere. The evidence was too solid. The witness testimony too consistent. They'll serve their full sentences with minimal possibility of early release. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town come to life beyond my garden fence. School children walked past on their way to classes, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Business owners opened their shops with the confidence that came from knowing they could succeed through honest competition rather than corrupt advantage. Young families pushed strollers along sidewalks that led to a future built on merit rather than manipulation. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Everything that happened? Everything you set in motion?" I considered the question seriously. Had there been other ways to address the corruption that had festered in Cedar Falls for so long? Could I have chosen a path that resulted in reform rather than destruction for the families who'd controlled the town's economy? "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that 3 families became so comfortable with exploiting their neighbors that they couldn't imagine any other way of doing business. I regret that their wives became so bored with their privileged lives that they turned cruelty into entertainment." "But you don't regret stopping them?" "Never. Every family that's now free from predatory loans, every worker who's earning fair wages, every customer who's receiving honest service represents a victory for basic human decency. The only regret I have is that it took so long for someone to hold them accountable." Margaret nodded, understanding the distinction between regret and satisfaction, between wishing things had been different and being glad they'd finally been made right. "What's next for the Foundation?" "We've been approached by communities in 3 other states, places where similar patterns of corruption have taken root. They want help in building the kind of evidence base and competitive alternatives that made our success possible." "Are you interested?" "Very much so. What we learned here about combining economic competition with legal accountability could be a model for reforming small-town corruption anywhere it exists." As the afternoon progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from devastating loss to purposeful action. Thomas's death had left me vulnerable to the kind of cruelty that small-minded people mistake for power, but it had also freed me from the social constraints that had previously limited my options. The church ladies had seen a grieving widow, and assumed she would be an easy target for their manufactured scandals and whispered assassinations. They'd mistaken grief for weakness, kindness for stupidity, and Christian charity for unlimited tolerance. They'd never imagined that the quiet woman they'd chosen to torment had resources they couldn't comprehend, connections they'd never suspected, and a moral framework that valued justice over social harmony. Most importantly, they'd failed to understand that some people become more dangerous when they have nothing left to lose, and that a woman who'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to her was immune to the kind of social pressure they'd always used to control others. The sun was setting by the time Margaret left, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of the dawn I'd watched 6 months earlier. On the morning I'd decided to stop being a victim and start being an agent of change. I walked through my garden one last time before heading inside, noting which plants needed water, which ones were ready for pruning, which ones had grown strong enough to transplant to new locations where they could thrive. Like those plants, Cedar Falls had needed pruning of its corrupt elements before healthy growth could resume. Like them, the community had required someone willing to do the difficult work of rooting out problems that had been ignored for too long. The woman who'd believed that Christian forgiveness meant accepting endless abuse had learned that true Christianity sometimes required the courage to ensure that abusers faced consequences for their actions. The widow who'd thought her useful life was behind her had discovered that her most important work was just beginning. As I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and the newspaper that now carried stories of hope rather than corruption, I thought about the letter I'd received that morning from a woman in Ohio whose own community was struggling with similar problems. She'd heard about Cedar Falls and wanted advice on how to build the kind of coalition that could challenge entrenched corruption. Tomorrow, I would begin planning another campaign for justice, another effort to prove that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary greed when they had the courage to fight back intelligently and persistently. The church ladies had wanted to destroy me with their whispers and their manufactured scandals. Instead, they'd created something they'd never anticipated. A woman who understood that the most powerful weapon against corruption was the truth, systematically gathered and strategically deployed. They'd taught me that patience and planning could accomplish what anger and protests never could. They'd shown me that the most devastating attacks were often the ones that seemed like acts of kindness until their true purpose became clear. Most importantly, they'd demonstrated that sometimes the most Christian thing a person could do was ensure that justice prevailed, regardless of the social cost. The woman they'd tried to break had become the architect of their downfall. The community they'd tried to control had become a model of ethical business practices. The reputation they'd tried to destroy had become a symbol of what was possible when good people refused to accept exploitation as inevitable. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I smiled at the irony of it all. In trying to make me pay for sins I'd never committed, they'd forced me to commit the one sin they'd never anticipated. The sin of ensuring that their actual crimes were finally, thoroughly, and permanently punished. It had been, without question, the most righteous sin of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.